Hey there, Golden Bears. How are we today? I hope you're doing well and groovy. Let's go ahead and get started on this. It's the effects of World War I at home, Module 7, Chapter 5. Here is a great quote of W.B. Du Bois. Remember, he and Booker T. Washington were not antagonists by any means, but they were both two strong voices in this attempt to eliminate racism across the landscape of America. And so Du Bois, if you remember, founded the NAACP and was a big advocate of trying to change the institutions from the top down. And so here's a quote from him where he states by the God in heaven, we are cowards and jackasses. Now that the war is over, World War I is talking about, we do not marshal every ounce of our brain and brawn to fight a sterner, longer, more unbending battle against the forces of hell in our own land. What is he referring to? Racism. And this is 1919. Would you think America has made much improvement on that? Probably not. And we need to continue to be thinking in such radical language such as Du Bois is citing in order for us to keep making roads and steps towards unifying America. This is probably the worksheet that you will be using for this time period here, the comparison between the Gilded Age and the 1920s with regard to government and political policies, and so you'll be paying attention to that. And with that, I want to tell just a little brief story. Think back, if you can, of what it was like to go from elementary school. Remember elementary school, you had like 3 play times, a long lunch, you got to color and run and jump and do all sorts of fun things. And I can remember when I was in my time period, back when the dinosaurs roamed the earth, from 5th grade, you then went into middle school. We called it middle school, which was 6th and 7th grade. A little different than what you guys have now, because then we had a junior high and then we went into a high school scenario. Well, I can remember kind of being really concerned and even talking to my older brother. I said, hey, we call him Pookie. Pookie, dude, what's it like up there? You only have like no breaks and you go to all these different teachers and you have only, lunchtime. When do you find time to play? And he kind of giggled. He goes, well, by the time you get to middle school, you won't miss it much. You'll be hanging out and trying to meet friends, and maybe you'll just, like girls and you want to talk to girls. I'm like, hey, I couldn't fathom the idea of any of that per se, But so I do remember thinking of how fearful it was. By the time I stepped on campus at Acacia Middle School, it was weird because I noticed this is in Emmett days. We only had, I think there were probably 5 elementary schools, but there's only 1 middle school. So all these kids would come from different elementary schools that kind of knew each other and would kind of hang out and bro out and kind of be familiar. But not quickly, but over time, and then a week or two, we discovered there would be fights that would break out across school. Why? Well, because him, an elementary kid, would say something bad to a Ramona elementary kid. Ramona elementary kid then would have a friend that was Little Lake Elementary. And then soon it would just be like this melee on campus. And, it was just like dogs coming into the kennel for the first time. Who's going to be the big bad dog of the campus? And so I could remember that there was some times that you were fearful. There was 2 or 3 kids that were like the bullies on campus that everybody tried to avoid. I couldn't. This is a longer story, but I would have to say, I think 1/3 of the way through my 6th grade, Gary was one of those school bullies, and something happened, and next thing we know, it's Doug and Gary who were having to break out into a fight and on campus. And anyhow, it was just scary times and a whole lot of convulsions of dynamics of people groups trying to figure things out. And in that, who do we trust, who do we not trust? And so in regards, there's going to be some of that aspect of a middle school playground and a middle school experience and the scare that has some similarities to this thing called the Red Scare, when the communists are growing and expanding and begin to have an inroads and influence across the landscape of America. Okay, so today, or in this learning target here, we're going to talk about how there were restrictions on Americans post-World War One. Then there was the rise of communism, which we call the Red Scare. Then we're going to talk about how the end of World War One really brought some challenges to the war production, to the production of goods that led to a greater migration of people. And then we're going to finish up in looking at really what was the African American experience like with this great migration, it was called, coming from the South as they went north or west during this time. So let us go ahead and jump in. So post-World War One, we need to be mindful that, please kind of remember that about halfway through World War One, there was a revolution in Russia. And so this revolution, you had the October and the February Revolution, ultimately basically turned it upside down to where you now have this group of people called the Bolsheviks, and under Lenin, they're maybe basically coming up with this mindset that we're pulling out of the war. Sorry, they're Allied powers, but we're gone. We have issues of our own. And so it kind of left the Allies struggling. The Germans were were very, very happy to sign that agreement and pact with them, of a non-aggression pact, so that way took them off of the table. And, you know, unfortunately, Americans entered in the war somewhere a little bit after that time. But this growth of this new Russian revolution based and founded in communist principles, which essentially are an attack and anathema on what America and our constitution of capitalism is about, really became intensified. And so this Comintern it's talked about is a group of intentional activities to design on Russian soil, on the Russian Bolshevik Russian Party, to begin finding ways to send in conspirators, if you will, to begin kind of creating havoc along the American soil. And so, since there were so many immigrants coming into America from all over Europe, this was a concern for Americans and especially the American government, and they kind of labeled it the Red Scare. Around the same time, there was some people who, during the war, who were advocates of the Communist Party and who were big on distributing pamphlets, etc. One of them, his name was Schenck, was arrested and for distributing materials that spoke against the government and saying how the war was for rich people and they're using the pawns of the working class to fight out war for him. That as the General Secretary of the Socialist Party in America, he was found guilty of encouraging people to avoid the military draft. Remember, we were trying to find almost 3 million people to join the draft, and here he is encouraging them not to. Well, Schenck and the United States, the decision was that, yes, this was illegal. It was basically could be considered espionage, and basically it ultimately led to this decision. This was a clear and present danger. And during a time of war, the government can clamp down on the rights of freedom of speech and other freedoms that Americans might have. And Abrams versus United States was much the same thing taking place there. And that was another court case that the Supreme Court used to find guilty of 5 anarchists who were distributing leaflets denouncing U.S. military efforts and trying to, overthrow what happened in America. So at the bottom there, you see this little box there. Like, there is a difference between patriotism, nationalism, and nativism. And I would hope that you kind of would begin recognizing those things, that this nativism often turns into racism. And that's the part that America has continually struggled with as we looked at history across the landscape for us. Moving on, well, during post-war, when the social turmoil is still happening, we have, on one hand, a lot of people getting paid well, and factories still churning out some military things, but they haven't made the adjustment to going back into, a production for consumers. And so what this means is there's some supply issues. There isn't enough to go around. And what does this create is that prices go up almost by 77%, because I might have a little money because of the war and working all those shifts, and I have to go pay for these things, but often there's shortages, and so this creates a problem for that. And then as a result of that tension point, unions begin to kind of creep back in. If you remember, prior to the war, many unions agreed to minimize their influence as long as the government signed treaties, or treaties, if you will, agreements that one, unions can exist, but two, they will increase pay and lessen hours. It's all right, and that was fine and dandy during the war because they couldn't find enough workers. Well, what do you do now after the war? Well, this is where the tension point is going to begin, and so many labor unions are going to begin frustrating and agitating and beginning to strike across all sorts of places. I mean, for one of them, I think one of the strikes took place in Boston, where the police force completely walked off the streets, and there were like 10 to 12 days of looting and burning and stealing, etc. And then the National Guard had to come in under Calvin Coolidge's requests to kind of keep people safe. Who do the public officials and newspapers blame? The communists and the socialists for all those types of violence. And was that true or untrue? Just rather convenient. Instead of saying, "Hey, government, why didn't you, more quickly transition from making bombs to, bed sheets, if you will, or whatever?" They quickly kind of blamed the labor unions for their problem. Well, what resulted is that there were a group of immigrants that were on American soil. Were they Russian or communist or not still wasn't found out. But these radicals sent bombs, almost up to 30 bombs on May 1st, which is kind of famous day for workers across the world. And most of them were caught and didn't explode, but one of them that is significant here in this path towards anarchy, one of them made its way all the way into Mitchell Palmer's front door. That's the Attorney General, the leading defender of all things for the president to guide them through the legal steps. What does this do? It ensues a major attention grabber and decision by our government to lead out the Palmer raids, they're called. Notice, named it after him, to begin looking for, rooting out, and prosecuting these communists who had sent these bombs and who had an intention of what? Creating anarchy and disrupting the American political and economic and social structures. Here's where's a name that you might become familiar with. We'll reevaluate him when we get into World War II, but we find it right after World War I here in 1919, 1920. Along comes this young guy named J. Edgar Hoover, who is brought in to begin investigating under the Department of Justice, not quite the FBI yet, where they bring in 6,000 suspects without any mention of protecting their rights or their liberties. They had no lawyers there to defend what they were doing. So 6,000 people were brought in and interrogated. What was the net result? 556 people were deported. Under what grounds? Under what reasons? We don't know. There was no evidence of them found, and there was no court dates. There was no lawyers, nothing, except 556 people were deported. So talk about an overreach of our government during a time when, was that necessary or not? That's the beauty of this next organization here that we want to talk about, is they did recognize the ACLU, an organization that still exists today to help defend the rights of the marginalized or those who don't have a voice. All right, they formed to monitor the government, in which the government oversteps their boundaries with regard to our Bill of Rights as members of this nation. And so they began to push back and attack and say, no, you didn't provide the rights necessary for many of these people who you booted out, and so we're going to begin watching what you do. Well, under the J. Edgar Hoover's directorship, we see a crazy scare and continuation of neighbors kind of turning on neighbors, workers, co-workers turning on co-workers, where who was suspected of being radicals and not This is a very interesting time and a very confusing time and muddled time in California, in American history. At the same time, we also have this influenza that breaks out that lasts for almost 2 years' time. Interesting, almost, you can see we're in 2020 is a good comparison that by, in February or so of 2020, we had almost 400,000 people dying of this COVID disease. But in 1918, about 675,000 people, or 20% of America's population, was killed. It went on to affect millions more across the globe. And so you can imagine there's tons of turmoil going on across the landscape of America as well as the globe. Here you see is a picture of tents to where hospital staff are doing their best to work with people that have or might have had this influenza as well. And the turmoil continues where we have this thing called the Great Migration. And you can see that those in the South are leaving by the droves. Why? Is it really truly just about the jobs in the North or the opportunities that can be happening out in the West? You can see purple is where most of the growth and where people are moving toward. And here you can see where many of the poor or disenfranchised whites and blacks are moving outward. But my question is, are they moving out because there's more jobs, or are they moving out because they fear the Jim Crow laws and the continued role of the KKK, which we'll talk about in subsequent lecture? It's very strong and very real. And so what does this look like? That many are leaving to go fill these wartime industrial jobs that happened during the World War I. But while they're there and moving there, they've discovered, that many people still didn't want them there. A lot of immigrants had resentment towards them. The white people who were, let's say, in the Chicagos or in the New Yorks or in other industrial cities there along the Great Lakes, they believed that these African Americans were taking their jobs. And when reality is, no, they were often given the most menial jobs and often paid less than their counterparts. And it is until 1919 that we see here, post-war, the war ends, and America's experiencing some of the social challenges, that there on Lake Michigan in Chicago, there allegedly are a couple different beaches, and one of them is for whites and one of them is for African Americans. And one young African-American boy drifted across a little too far. Whites started throwing some rocks at him, hitting him. He dies. This then triggers days and days worth of rioting where hundreds die from both sides of white and African-American. Over 1,000 African-American families are displaced. This gives us an idea that although people left the South from the hatred and the KKK and the evil down there to come north, they might have found better paying jobs and lived better, but they also experienced tremendous amount of racism, and hence why my quote at the very, very beginning. Well, let's take a look now and turn away from the social aspect of what's happening, and let's look at how we're spending our money and how intervention is taking place during this time. You're going to discover that America's pendulum is going to swing back from progressives, where we had talked about in the prior chapters, where it was the job of the government to serve the needs of the people. Well, post-World War I, the government is going to now kind of begin getting in bed, if you will, with the economy. And they're going to work hard at finding ways in which the government can keep this robust growth happening. And so in order to do that, the current President Harding, and then that'll become Coolidge, Harding brings in his good old boys. And his good old boys, one of them is a banker that is a really wealthy tycoon. And they begin basically saying, we're not going to tax the wealthy anymore. We're going to have the FT, the Federal Trade Commission and the Federal Reserve Board work as ways to kind of keep business moving forward. And so this American plan, it is called, and these ideas of the trickle-down theory, it is soon called, they hope will help fuel the American dream. What do I mean by this, trickle-down? So this is a cartoon. There's numerous cartoons that you can use there, and the theory that the Republicans had is, well, if we start at the top and the wealthy with their bottle of champagne have the chance to, any of their excess money, if they're not taxed at 66% like they were before, and they're now only taxed at 20%, they're going to use that extra that they have, and it's going to filter down into buying of stocks. That'll then create new businesses, and that'll create more crop production, and the farmer's going to experience some, and then some nonprofit. But look what happens by the time we get halfway down. The bottle is ended, and there's nothing left to get down to businesses, employees, and citizens. And so this is an interesting theory that the Republicans have held, and it is still a theory that some Republicans follow up until the late 1980s with Ronald Reagan in terms of being president. We'll talk about that later when we get to him, but just know that this trickle-down economics is a theory that came out post-World War I and was earnestly followed during that time. What other things take place? Well, as I said, the government is run by President Harding, who he himself probably wasn't a crook, but he had a lot of money-hungry friends of his that he put as posts in terms of in public office and in his cabinet, and it is there that they often took advantage of Harding being a nice guy, trusting everybody, to where one of them was the teapot scandal. And the teapot scandal was involving basically American oil reserves. This was in Wyoming. There was another one in California out there around Bakersfield, where essentially Mr. Fall, who was in charge of the Interior, Albert Fall, he allowed these lands with the oil companies to be sold to private or leased to private companies of his choosing. And as a result of that, they gave him a kickback for a turn of like $300,000 over time. That's not, that might not seem like a lot of money now, but back then that was a huge kickback, especially when it's government-held properties. And so this was discovered, and he was convicted and sent to jail for collusion and corruption. And so very cool. There is some progressive mindset going on there, but this revealed some degree that, again, government wasn't out for the needs of the people. It was out for the needs of the wealthy and the industrial class during this time period. Well, Harding dies. Coolidge then takes power, and we'll talk about him a little bit later on. But despite some of these hardships and setbacks, there is innovation still taking place in, think, Ford factory and almost every other factory that they're using the scientific management, which involves accounting and practices of accounting, to where they manage their business using vertical and horizontal integration down to almost a perfect science. And then the assembly line continues to be developed and used across all sorts of spectrums in the economic realm. Another aspect is this rise of consumerism. America, because the trickle-down theory, is banking on Americans buying more and more and more. The more that we buy, the more that factories can churn out. And so America begins producing a lot of luxury items, consumer-oriented items, everything from the refrigerators all the way down to more cars. And this created an incredible jumpstart for our economy, and lasted for a good almost 8 to 10 years post the World War I. And so it seemed like these Republican leaders, from Harding to Coolidge, were brilliant because Americans didn't have it so good before. Well, eventually this is going to come to a close here, which we'll talk about soon. But look at the importance that we have of just the automobile workers. That industry alone had over 4 million workers. Like 1 in 8 Americans worked in the factories that produced cars. An incredible importance there along the landscape. Now look, why is that significant? Well, if 1 out of 8 jobs are held by Americans for the automobile, they're certainly going to keep marketing and marketing and marketing for even women can drive these cars. They're so easy because, the more cars they sell, the more opportunity to keep employees hired. But also, cars changed living patterns as roads were constructed and being converted from dirt and gravel to where now they're paving them and going out further and further. This enabled them to leave the city even further and further and create these suburbs. This enabled chances for families to travel, or enabled new businesses to crop up, namely hotels and gas stations. And funnily enough, kids can go out and go hit Blueberry Hill or whatever it's called, and enjoy getting to know each other in more intimate ways, I suspect. Well, these advertisements conveyed to Americans that we need to keep staying up with the Smiths, as you will, and keep buying and buying and consuming and consuming. And how do we do all of this? On this new thing called credit, that banks were very happy to lend out to get more Americans on credit. And we'll talk about the collapse of that here, soon. So we now talk about how this urban growth and this then leading to this perilous prosperity is that even though there's tremendous amount of growth going on, it causes a lot of changes in the cities as well. And what we will become to see that's very important is that there's going to become a growing income inequality. And so some are going to be able to afford these new things that are being created, but over time, most will not. In fact, most people will be living underneath the poverty line for most of this. And this inequality of income is going to become the biggest issue that will probably trigger one of the 4 or 5 triggers for this thing we call the Great Depression. What was going to trigger this Great Depression? Well, the speculation on stock market, buying risky real estate in Florida, banks lending out more money for people to buy stock in which they didn't have that money to pay if there was ever a call in for that stock. For instance, if I was to buy Apple stock and I bought 100 shares, but I only had if I only had amount of 2 shares out of the 100 to cover, and then when it comes for me to pay that bill, I don't have the money, that creates a lot of problems. We have farmers increasing tremendous problems. Why? Because there's the lack of demand across Europe during the war, and so they went and spent more money and expanded their farms in order to meet that need, and that is causing. And so what is a result of this is that we then have a major bubble that's going to be exploded. And normally we could have withstood that, but America went and kind of did something a little bit foolish. What was foolish is that I think America was owed like $11 billion from various countries, whether it be England or whether it be France, whether it be Russia or whether it be even Germany. And so we had to come up with a repayment plan that essentially said, okay, we're going to loan back more money to Germany so Germany can then repay England and France and get them off their neck. And that way England and France then could repay us back. And this became a cycle of basically monopoly money that had no value. And this, along with those other 4 or 5 things, essentially triggered America going into a major crisis, which we now know as the Great Depression. So to summarize, yes, post the World War I, there were a lot of positive aspects taking place with regard to consumers and ability to purchase things and buy things that made their life easy. But the sad part of that is that very few people, it was discovered, had money of that because of income inequality. And we also have America that's being splintered and torn apart because of this thing called Red Scare and J. Edgar Hoover and what will soon be the FBI challenging the rights of Americans and the Bill of Rights that we have of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So peace. We'll see you at the next 7.6. Take care.